Chapter 20 is about sound, and sound is one type of mechanical wave. But it's one that's of great interest to us because we get most of our information about the environment by either light, which is waves we see with our eyes, or with sound. Now, you've probably all heard that question. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? And the answer to that really is it depends on how you define sound. I've heard some people say that sound has three parts. It has to have a source, something that vibrates, or makes at least a pulse. A tree falling from the forest would be one wave pulse. It has to have a medium to travel through, and it has to have a listener. If you set up your definition where you need a source, a medium, and a listener, then I suppose that if there's no one there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound, because it's the listener and the listener's brain that actually interprets the sound into something meaningful. But if you define sound as simply a mechanical wave, well then certainly if a tree falls in a forest, it will make a mechanical wave. We know that sound waves originate when matter vibrates, okay? Those sound waves travel out through the air most of the time, but they can also travel through fluid. I'm sure you've been in a swimming pool and been underwater, and you can still hear the noises above the water because the sound wave will travel through. Or you can even, you've seen probably on television where people put their ear to the ground or their ear to the railroad rail, because sound will travel even faster through a solid. In fact, solids are the most efficient. They're the fastest conductors of sound. Liquids are next, and gases are actually the poorest conductors of sound waves. However, our ears are designed to hear sound waves conducted in air, so we actually hear the best. We can interpret those waves better if they're transmitted through the air. Generally, the frequency of the source, whatever's vibrating, that's the frequency of the sound wave that reaches us. Now, humans interpret sound, and they interpret frequency as pitch. High frequency waves have higher pitches. If I talk way up here, that's a very high-pitched, annoying voice. Or I can talk way down here in a very low-pitched voice. But when I talk up here, the frequency's high. When I talk down here, the frequency's low. So, frequency is controlled by the source, what's causing the wave. The other thing we might think about is amplitude. Humans interpret the amplitude of a sound wave as volume. If I get obnoxiously loud and start shouting at you, that's a higher amplitude wave than if I whisper and you can barely hear me, okay? Both of those things, frequency and amplitude, are determined by the source of the sound. We know that humans have a limited range of what frequencies they can hear. Young people, and I mean really young, so maybe a 6-year-old, can hear from 20 hertz up to about 20,000 hertz. As we get older, we tend to lose this high frequency pitch. It's entirely possible that I only hear from 20 hertz to 12,000 hertz. That's okay. The high frequency hearing loss is usually not too critical. One thing though you might want to keep in mind is when you lose your hearing, it's generally permanent. If you listen to really loud noises, people that work in construction with jackhammers and heavy equipment need to be really careful because inside your inner ear, there's some tiny little sensors, or little hair-like sensors called cilia. And as you age, eventually those may die off and break off, but they don't grow back. However, those can be damaged by really loud noises. So if you're putting your earbuds in your ears and cranking the volume up, once you damage that cilia, you don't get it back later when you're tired of loud music. So you really should take care of your hearing to prevent unnecessary hearing loss. Now, this age-related loss at the upper end is probably going to happen no matter what. Ranges of frequencies outside this have different names. This is what we can hear. If we have frequencies less than 20 hertz, that's called infrasonic, as in below what we can hear, if you think of sonic being the word what we can hear. There are animals that do hear these low frequencies. I believe there are some whales that hear below 20 hertz. I know that elephants with those very large ears can hear below 20 hertz. Frequencies higher than 20,000 hertz, those noises, those frequencies are called ultrasonic. There are a lot of animals that hear ultrasonic. Dogs, you've all seen those dog whistles that humans can't hear, but the dog can hear. Cats, bats, there are a lot of animals that can hear frequencies higher than we can. Bats and dolphins actually make frequencies we cannot hear and send those out, and then they echo off objects. That's called echolocation, and they use that to see things with their ears, so to speak. Any elastic medium, air, liquid, or sound, can transmit sound waves. An elastic medium, even in a solid where you have some rigid display of particles, if those particles are free to vibrate back and forth from some equilibrium point, they can conduct sound waves. There are inelastic things that don't go back. Putty doesn't conduct sound very well. Truthfully, things like feather pillows and things don't conduct sound very well. But elastic materials, a steel rod, think of that being very hard, water, and certainly air molecules are all capable of transmitting sound. What you cannot transmit sound through is a vacuum, though. Remember, sound is a mechanical wave. It has to have a matter that it travels through. We drew a picture of a sound wave. I drew one of these, I believe, in the last chapter, but sound travels out three-dimensionally in all directions. But I'm just going to look at a little section of a sound wave. It would look something like this. You would have areas where you have extremely high density concentrations. And then you have places where you don't. These are those compressions. Sometimes longitudinal waves are called pressure waves because they create areas of high pressure, and in between we have these areas of low pressure. Your eardrum is sensitive to very, very small changes in air pressure. I'd have to fact check, so I'm not saying. I believe it's 1 part out of every 10,000 or 1 part out of every 100,000. A change in air pressure that small can be detected by your eardrums. If you think about it, you don't detect small changes of air pressure usually with your skin. Now, we've all heard bass that was really loud and were really low, where it like vibrated the whole floor. We really could feel it with our skin. But for the most part, it's that very, very sensitive eardrum that picks up these really small changes in air pressure. We know that the speed of sound depends, if we're talking about air, and that's what we're talking about, the speed of sound in air depends on several things. Wind conditions, if the wind's blowing towards you, you will hear the sound being carried towards you through the air. It depends on temperature. The higher the temperature, the faster the sound will travel. Also depends some on humidity. At room temperature, we think of room temperature being approximately 20 degrees Celsius. The speed of sound in air is very close to 340 meters per second. It travels slightly slower if it's colder outside or colder where you are. Or on a really hot day in East Texas, it will travel a little bit faster outside. Important to realize that the speed of sound does not depend on the frequency or the amplitude of the sound. Those things are determined by the source. However, all sound waves will travel at the same speed. High frequency, low frequency, high amplitude, low amplitude. The speed of a wave depends on the medium. So all of the sound waves, if they're all traveling through room temperature at 20 degrees Celsius, should travel at that 340 meters per second. Now, if the sound wave hits a hard surface, most of that wave can be reflected. We call that an echo. Generally, we get echoes when it hits a hard, smooth surface, like a granite wall. I think you've all heard of echoes off of mountains and things. Let's just think about this. One formula that we sometimes use that goes way back to the early chapters is we know that distance equals velocity times time. Suppose that you are in a boat. You've probably all heard of depth finders. Depth finders send a sound wave down to the bottom of the lake, and then it picks up how long it takes for that sound wave to reach back. So here it is. Here's the bottom of the lake. It sends this sound wave, and I know sound waves don't look like that. That's transverse. But it helps us visualize all the way there and all the way back. If I tell you how quickly sound travels through water, you should be able to figure out how deep the lake is. Let's do an example. The speed of sound in water, and this depends on temperature too, so for this particular water on this particular day is, we'll keep it simple, 1,500 meters per second. if it takes 2 seconds for a sound wave to travel to the bottom of the lake and back, how deep is the lake? Okay, we know it's traveling 1,500 meters per second. We know it travels for 2 seconds. Well, if we use distance equals velocity times time, 1,500 meters per second for 2 seconds, that sound wave traveled 3,000 meters. Traveled 1,500 meters the first second and another 1,500 meters the second second. But we do need to remember when we're talking about an echo, it's a round trip. It went down and then back up. So if at 3,000 miles is the round trip, then the distance here must be 1,500 meters. Traveled down 1,500 meters in the first second, it traveled up 1,500 meters in the second. So just keep in mind that when you're solving problems involving echo, the total distance is going to be the velocity times the time. But that total distance probably represents going there and then coming back. Sound waves reflect. Reflection is a property of all waves, and we'll see that light rays also reflect. Another characteristic of sound waves or all waves is something called refraction. Refraction is the bending of waves due to a change in speed. We normally think of sound going out in straight lines in all directions, but if it runs into a change in temperature, we're going to get a bending. We know that sound will travel faster in warm air than it travels in cool air. It will slow down in cool air, okay? So it will tend to cause it to bend. So we get a lot of refraction with sound waves, either due to temperature differences in the air. You can have warm air masses and cold air masses, or temperature differences in water. You can have cool and warm ocean currents, okay? These cause the sound waves to not travel in a straight line. Now, one of the more interesting uses of reflection and refraction of sound, as important as it is for the fishermen to know how deep the lake is used in the medical field, in sonography or ultrasound. Ultrasound, you'll remember, are sound waves with a frequency that's greater than 20,000 hertz. So these are high frequency waves that you could not hear with your ear. However, they're very safe, and medical professionals use reflection primarily, but also refraction to look at internal organs using sound waves. Or the most popular use probably is to look at unborn babies inside their mothers, okay? So refraction is the bending of a wave due to temperature difference or to a change in speed. And reflection, of course, is just an echo of bouncing off because of a change in medium. everything in nature, or almost everything in nature, will vibrate at something called its natural frequency. If we think about the period of a pendulum, it's a perfect example of something that has a natural frequency or natural period. Remember, frequency is just the inverse of the period. Well, a child's swing is an example of a pendulum. If you have a child and they're on a swing, so here they are, they're swinging from here all the way through to here. And they have a very natural period back and forth. If that child wants to swing higher, he has to do one of two things. Either A, he has to be old enough to pump his legs himself, in which case by pumping his legs with the natural frequency, it's like he gives himself a little extra push. Or if he's a smaller child, he gets his parents to do it. And mom or dad comes back here and every time gives that child a push just at the natural frequency. Now, if there's no friction, that will always make the amplitude go high. Now, sometimes parents give just enough push to keep the same height. But what will happen is if you're pushing at the natural frequency, you will get larger and larger amplitudes. Now, there used to be a cartoon called Recess. I don't know if any of you remember it, but one of the characters on that cartoon was a girl called Swinger Girl. And the big question was always, would she ever go? She'd swing higher and higher. Was she ever going to go over the swing? And what would happen if she did? These increased by amplitudes, this large increase in amplitude is called resonance. That is a large increase in amplitude caused by forced vibration at the natural frequency. One example of that that's pretty easy to illustrate, but I can't illustrate it because I don't have any tuning forks at my house, is to take a tuning fork. You probably all saw tuning forks. And you give it a little whack. When you give it a little whack, it starts vibrating at whatever its natural frequency is. So if this has a natural frequency of 40, and it starts vibrating, it sends out these sound waves going out in all directions. If I have another one over here that I don't hit, so it has 0 amplitude, if I wait just a minute, it starts vibrating too. And you can actually hear it making a sound, even though you never struck this one. However, if I have a third one over here, and it can be just as close, I'm just drawing a third one, and it has a natural frequency of 560 hertz, it won't start vibrating. It's not receiving a forced vibration at its natural frequency, so it doesn't do anything. This one began vibrating because something was pushing on it with just the right frequency, the frequency that it wants to vibrate at. You guys have probably all played around with water glasses or seen on television how if you have like a wine glass, and usually you put a little water in the wine glass, and you run your finger around the top, it makes a sound, a singing noise. That's its natural frequency. Well, I can't do it. If you go online and you Google Ella Fitzgerald commercials for Memorex, she can sing at the natural frequency of the wine glass, and just by singing, she forces it to vibrate. Picture that round top of that oscillating and vibrating. She can shatter a wine glass with her voice using resonance. When the amplitude of that got too big, the glass would shatter. One of the places where we use not forced vibrations, but resonance, is when you tune in your radio station. The electronics have a natural frequency, but when you turn the dial, when you tune it, you're changing the natural frequency of your electronics so that they pick up the frequency that's being broadcast. So if you're listening to 105.1 FM, it's being broadcast at 105 million hertz. It's a very high frequency. But you adjust your radio to detect signals at 105 million hertz. That's the frequency of your radio. So that's the sound that gets amplified by your speakers. So you hear that radio station, you don't hear any other radio stations. Sound waves interfere just like any other type of wave interferes. Anytime sound waves interfere constructively, you get an amplification of the sound. The sound is louder. There's a place in the nation's capital, in the dome, that if you stand in one spot and somebody else is over in another spot, they can whisper and you can hear them because the sound bounces off that dome in such a way that it gets amplified or has constructive interference at your location if you're standing in the right spot. On the other hand, we've probably all heard, possibly have sat in a movie theater or someplace where you just think, I can't hear anything. But if you just sit one chair over, you hear fine. That's an example of destructive interference, where the sound waves are bouncing off the surfaces, but they meet at that location in such a way that they tend to cancel out. Okay? Anybody that designs auditoriums and theaters and things, they do things to help amplify the sound and try to eliminate any of those dead spots. The last thing I want to talk about is something called beats. Beats happen when you have two things that are almost at the same frequency. You hear it a lot with music. If you have two different trumpets and one's playing at 440 hertz and the other one's playing at 443 hertz, that means they're not quite in tune. Their frequency's slightly off. If they're both supposed to be at 440, but maybe one's at 443, you hear a really interesting thing. The volume fluctuates and it sounds like wah, 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 wah. If I had two tuning forks that were just barely off, we could strike them and you could hear that wah, wah. That's called beats. And the frequency of the beats is simply the difference between the two frequencies. So if I had something that was supposed to be at 440, but it was at 443, the difference in that is 3 hertz. So what I would do is I would hear 3 beats per second. Wah, wah, wah. It's really noticeable. That's how people can tune musical instruments. If they have something set that's sort of the standard, they make tuning devices, and you do pluck an instrument or you play the note on your horn or your piano, you can hear the beats. If you can adjust the tension in the string of the guitar or the piano, whatever you're doing, you can make that beat disappear. But those are called beat frequencies. The math for beat frequencies couldn't be any simpler. It's simply the difference. It's most pronounced when things are almost in tune. All right, I think that's everything I wanted to say about sound and waves. Of course, also, if you've got questions, be sure you email, be sure you show up and ask them at the Collaborate meetings. All right, thank you.